Okay, welcome everyone to the latest installment of the Just Good Food Colloquium. I will be going through just a couple orders of business here in terms of safety and a few rules for tonight before we get into the land acknowledgement and introducing our guest speaker. And welcome, of course, to those visiting us online as well. So first thing to know is exits for this auditorium are to the sides of the stage and then in back over there. Hopefully those will not be needed. There are unisex bathrooms out in the lobby to the left a little bit as you exit if you need those. Please do silence your phones. No recording, no photos during the lecture. And with that, that's all of those ground rules in place. I would like to invite up Nakota Thompson, who's a student here and a Narragansett tribal member and a recipient of the scholarship for Narragansett students. And Nakota will be walking us through the land acknowledgement tonight.
We welcome you tonight to the lands of the Narragansett and Niantic people. Tonight, as we gather to discuss the creation of equitable and sustainable resilient food systems, let us not forget these same goals should be extended to people as well to create equitable, sustainable, and resilient systems for all. The University of Rhode Island has taken a big step towards this goal. The scholarship for Narragansett tribal members has opened up opportunities for me and others to be a big part of a vibrant learning environment. I'm thankful to be able to stand here at URI, an undergraduate member and a member of the Narragansett tribe. I hope things shared here tonight as you discuss labor and the food system will be fruitful, encouraged by the knowledge that the successes in creating equitable, sustainable, and resilient systems elsewhere. Tabani Ka Kanupalam. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Nakota. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for tonight. Very excited to introduce Saru Jayaraman, the co-founder and president of One Fair Wage and the director of the Food Labor Research Center at the University of California, Berkeley. After 9/11, together with displaced World Trade Center workers, she co-founded the Restaurant Opportunities Center, or ROC, which grew into a national movement of restaurant workers, employers, and consumers. She then launched One Fair Wage as a national campaign to end all subminimum wages in the United States, and I've just been led to understand that she's engaged in a movement here in Rhode Island on that same effort to raise the minimum wage in our state. The story of Saru and her co-founder's work founding ROC has been chronicled in the book The Accidental American, and the story of the One Fair Wage campaign has been profiled in the award-winning documentary Waging Change. Saru is a graduate of Yale Law School and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Her media appearances are extensive. She was listed in CNN's Top 10 Visionary Women, recognized as a champion of change by the White House in 2014. She received a James Beard Foundation Leadership Award in 2015 and was the San Francisco Chronicle Visionary of the Year in 2019. Saru has also authored 4 books, including her latest, One Fair Wage, Ending All Subminimum Pay in America, from the New Press. And she's also authored Behind the Kitchen Door from Cornell University Press, Forked, A New Standard for American Dining from Oxford University Press, and Bite Back, People Taking on Corporate Food and Winning. And before we invite her up on stage, she's asked us to show a brief video, which we'll do now.
26% say it will stay about the same. 50% say it's going to get worse. That is the highest that number has been since 1994. I want to bring in now president of One Fair Wage, Saru Jayaraman, who believes rather than running away from the economy, Democrats should embrace it to push for a higher minimum wage. Saru, thanks so much for joining us on this. We appreciate it. I want to play for you a little bit of Senator Bernie Sanders about how Democrats are handling the economy.
What are the Republicans' response to inflation? What do they want to do? Well, maybe they want to cut wages for workers. Do they want to raise the minimum wage? No, they don't. So I think it's important to take the attack to the Republicans. What do they want to do other than complain? Here is the reality. You know, you ask, Jake, why people are upset, why young people are upset, working class people are upset, and the answer is pretty simple. For the last 50 years in this country, real wages have not gone up. That's a reason to be upset.
What do you make of that, Saru?
It's so true. Listen, three things. Minimum wage is always an incredibly popular issue, and even more so during times of inflation. Minimum wage polls at between 60 and 80%, which is often double the approval rating of many Democratic candidates and Democratic incumbents. So this is an incredibly popular issue that is even more popular during inflationary periods because, as Senator Sanders says, most working people are thinking, how am I going to afford the cost of a gallon of gas? You know, in the restaurant industry, for example, there's a subminimum wage for tipped workers that's $2 or $3 or $4 in most states. When the cost of a gallon of gas is more than your hourly wage, you are thinking mostly about how am I going to survive? How am I going to get from place to place? How am I going to feed my kids? How am I even going to get to work to get a wage that's less than the cost of a gallon of gas? So it's always popular, even more popular during inflationary periods when people just can't afford to live. And two, there's evidence that it actually drives people out to vote, frankly, more than almost any other issue or candidate, when, especially for workers who are dealing with just how do I put food on the table.
I want to talk about subminimum wage, as you just mentioned. Some states putting that measure on the ballot. I believe Nevada, Nebraska, D.C. as well, helping to pushing to help minimum wage workers by placing measures on the ballot there. Here's what the New York Times says. In D.C., a measure would ban the sub-minimum wage by 2027. A ballot proposal in Portland, Maine would ban sub-minimum wage pay and bring the minimum wage to $18 an hour over 3 years. Explain to us exactly what sub-minimum wage is and how do you see the future of this legislation going?
Yeah, so at emancipation, the restaurant industry sought the ability to hire newly freed Black slaves, mostly Black women, actually, and extend slavery by hiring them for free, no wage at all, and let them live entirely on tips. Here we are 160 years later, the National Restaurant Association has argued to maintain that sub-minimum wage that was created at emancipation and allow people a wage as low as $2 an hour at the federal level and get the rest in tips. But here's the good news that we all should be talking about 2 weeks before this election. These workers, millions of them, 6 million tipped workers across America, are largely now refusing to work for these wages for the first time since emancipation. 1.2 million workers have left the industry. Millions more are leaving. And in response, we have tracked over 5,000 restaurants in 43 states now paying a full wage with tips on top of 15 and up, 20, 25 plus tips because they cannot get workers to come back any other way. So there's good news. Wages are going up. But what workers and even small business employers are asking for is policy to institutionalize those gains, make them permanent so that these workers actually feel like it's worth coming back. And that's what we should be talking about 2 weeks before the election. But wages are going up. Let's raise the wage through policy and get these workers back to work and also, frankly, get them out to vote. Because nothing drives low-wage workers to the polls. When you have to live on tips and you get a $2 or $3 wage, what is going to make you leave your job, you know, potentially get retaliated against or fired for leaving the job, not get the tips you would have earned by being there and go vote? It's the chance to actually get a full livable wage permanently going forward. That is the future of our industry, and that's what we should be talking about in this moment.
Saru Jayaraman, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Good to talk to you.
I think I broke it. No. Oh, wait. Okay, we're good. All right. With that, we are incredibly excited to hear what Saru has in store for us tonight, building on that video. So please join me in giving her a very, very warm Rhode Island welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Patrick. Thanks to everybody for having me. Can you hear me okay? Great. So I wanted to share this only because it was just Sunday, just 2 days ago, very recent and very timely. We have an election in 2 weeks, or less than that now, and we are, on the precipice of some really bad news, potentially. Climate change is on the horizon, or it's already here, I should say. Democracy is under threat. There's the chance that many of us who fought for rights as women in our lifetime are seeing them taken away. There's a lot of things that could be very depressing, overwhelming, concerning. But as I mentioned in the clip, there is one incredible piece of good news, and it is that workers are refusing across so many sectors, but particularly in the lowest wage sectors like the restaurant industry. They are refusing to work for poverty wages, and that is resulting in change. That is resulting in lots of employers who thought it was never, ever possible previously to raise wages doing so, and it is creating a new future for the restaurant industry, for the food system. I know that this series is about the food system, for our economy, and I think for our democracy, because it is proving that the things that we all assume to be inevitable, like economic inequality and poverty and these ridiculously low-wage jobs, are not inevitable, are not necessary, are not fixed, that they can change. And that's the change that's happening right now. So I just want to go a little bit more into depth in the context and history that I shared a little bit of in that very quick clip. And I shared some of this in the honors class earlier, but for those of you that weren't there, it's good history to know, important history to know. So look, the restaurant industry has been one of the largest and fastest growing private sector employers in the United States for decades. Pre-pandemic, it was 14 million workers. That was almost 1 in 10 American workers working in restaurants. It was also the #1 fastest growing employer. Pre-pandemic, we actually hit a world record. We became the first nation on earth that spends more on money food eaten outside of the home than on food eaten inside of the home. Maybe that's something to be proud of, maybe it isn't. It has created an enormous restaurant industry that is by far one of the largest and fastest growing employers in the United States. But that immense restaurant industry, as large as it is, and how many people here ever worked in the restaurant industry? So it's about half of the people in the room. As large as it is, as much as half of the room has worked in it, it has been one of the absolute lowest paying employers in the United States for generations, going all the way back to emancipation of slavery in this country. So tipping as a practice didn't originate in feudal Europe. It didn't originate in the US. It originated in feudal Europe. It was an extra or bonus that aristocrats and nobles gave to their inferiors, to servants, to serfs, to vassals, but always on top of a wage. When it came to the United States, it came on with rich Americans who were traveling at that time by ship to Europe, coming back, trying to show off that they knew the rules of Europe, trying to tip, and it was wildly rejected. Americans did not like tipping in the 1800s. They saw it as a vestige of feudalism. They said, we're a democracy. You should get good service regardless of how much you can afford to tip. And by the way, we think employers should pay their workers, not customers. In fact, Alexis de Tocqueville, part of his writings about democracy in America was that America is such a great democracy, there's no tipping. We don't have this feudal system from Europe. And in fact, as a result of that populist movement here in the United States, six states in the US banned tipping entirely because they said, we don't believe in this feudal system. We believe that workers should be paid by their employers, not customers. And that movement spread to Europe, and the labor movement picked it up in Europe and got rid of tipping in most of Europe with the rallying cry that we are professionals. We don't live off your largesse. We are no longer in feudal times. And one thing that's important to note about Europe is that they truly have professionalized hospitality. You go to school for many years to be a skilled professional in the hospitality industry. In the US, we went in the exact opposite direction because of a series of things that happened after 1853. In 1853, waiters who are mostly white men went on strike in very large cities in the US: Boston, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia. They were mostly white men. They got a wage. They received a wage from their employer. They wanted it to be higher, so they went on strike, one of the first national strikes. And in response, the restaurant industry really didn't want to pay these guys more, so they brought in as scabs, essentially, women, white women, who they thought they could pay less. So they brought in women first, and then 10 years later, something else happened that gave them, they thought, an even better idea, which was emancipation. And at emancipation, they found the ability to hire newly freed black people. And basically, there were two industries that did this. The restaurant industry and the Pullman Train Company both hired newly freed black slaves and said, you are so lucky, you are going to have the privilege of obtaining white people's tips. You're not going to get a wage from us. You're going to have the privilege of getting white people's tips. And many instances, black people were charged at that time for the privilege of accessing white people's tips. Shoe shiners, for example, in hotels or other spaces where white men would be charged for a booth, no pay, for the privilege of being able to access white people's tips. So I mentioned two industries. Besides the restaurant industry, the other industry that did this was the Pullman Train Company. And maybe some of you know the Pullman Train Company. It was luxury trains going from the East Coast to the West Coast. They hired tens of thousands of black men as porters. There's actually a really fabulous movie you all should see at some point called 10,000 Black Men Named George, because they called them all George as a way to infantilize and dehumanize these black men. They didn't know their names, they just called them all George. The Pullman Train Company hired tens of thousands of black men, didn't give them a wage, and said, you're going to have the privilege as porters of being able to access white people's tips. But a man named A. Philip Randolph formed the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first black union in the United States, and that's what the movie is about, won the right to an actual wage. He said we should be paid by the company. We shouldn't have to live exclusively on tips. But the black women who were hired by the restaurant industry were not so lucky. They were not allowed into the waitresses union at the time, and so they were left to a $0 wage and told by the restaurant industry, you are so lucky, you're going to be able to obtain tips. That's going to be your income. And that idea that a black woman could get nothing but tips was made law in 1938 as part of the New Deal, when everybody got the right to the federal minimum wage for the first time, but millions of black workers were left out. And this is where the food system really becomes the bottom of the economy, because it was both farm workers who were excluded and restaurant workers. So the two largest parts of the food system and the ends of the food system, the farms and the restaurants, were entirely excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act, from the bill that passed under FDR that gave everybody in the country the right to a minimum wage. Why did that happen? Well, there's a part of this history nobody talks about. In 1919, between emancipation in 1865 and the passage of the first federal minimum wage in 1938, in 1919, a group was formed called the National Restaurant Association. We call it the other NRA. Today, it's led by the chains, the IHOPs, the Denny's, the Applebee's, the Olive Gardens, Outback Steakhouse. That's who leads the NRA. We actually call the leaders of the other NRA the 4 Ds. Darden, which is the Olive Garden's parent company, which also owns Capitol Grill Steakhouse, Longhorn Steakhouse, Seasons 52, Bahama Breeze, and like 10 other brands. Denny's, Dine Equity, which is Applebee's and IHOP, and Disney. These are the 4 leaders of the 4 Ds, the 4 leaders of the other NRA. Other NRA was founded in 1919 with the express intent, mission, and purpose of suppressing 2 groups of workers' wages, agricultural workers and restaurant workers. Both happen to be food system workers, both happen to be black, mostly black at the time. So 1919, the other NRA was basically formed with the intent to suppress black workers' wages. 1938, both of these workers were excluded from the federal minimum wage. In the case of tipped workers, they were told, you get nothing. You get zero as long as you get tips. And we went from zero in 1938 all the way up to $2.13 an hour at the federal level. And you here in Rhode Island are $3.89, I believe, is your minimum wage for tipped workers. A ridiculous wage. As much as I love you, Rhode Island, I have to say the wage is ridiculous and a direct legacy of slavery. And Rhode Island remains one of 43 states that persists with this legacy of slavery based on an argument by this trade lobby that has been around for 100 years arguing we should be the only industry, not just in the United States, but frankly in the world, because we're the only country that does this. We should be the only industry that shouldn't have to pay our workers' wages. No, you, the customers, are paying our workers' wages, therefore we shouldn't have to. That is actually exactly how it functions. Every time you tip, it detracts from the worker's wage. It allows the employer to pay less than the minimum wage. That's the calculation. Your tip detracts from the worker's wage so that the employer can pay as little as $3.89, even though the full minimum wage is much higher. So the part of the argument of these last 100 years is we don't have to pay these folks. And they paint the picture of a white guy working in a fancy fine dining steakhouse in Providence or right here in Kingston. They say they're fine. They're making 6 figures in tips. They're doing quite well. When in fact, the overwhelming majority of tipped workers are women, disproportionately women of color. We have the highest rates of single moms of any industry in the United States. They're mostly women who work at IHOPs and Denny's and Applebee's. They struggle with 3 times the poverty rate of other workers and use food stamps at double the rate. And they have the absolute highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry in the U.S. because they have to tolerate so much from customers to get those tips. Now, there have always been 7 states that did it differently. California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska rejected this legacy of slavery decades ago and require full minimum wage with tips on top. If you listen to the other NRA, you would think where I live in California has absolutely no restaurants, because they like to say, if you made us pay a full wage, the industry would collapse, jobs would be lost, small businesses would die. When in fact, California and the 7 states with one fair wage, a full minimum wage with tips on top, have higher restaurant sales per capita than Rhode Island, higher job growth rates in the restaurant industry than Rhode Island, higher small business growth rates in the restaurant industry than Rhode Island, higher overall tipping rates than Rhode Island, 1/2 the rate of sexual harassment in the restaurant industry, because it turns out when you pay a woman a wage, she doesn't have to put up with as much from customers. She gets tips like every other state. She gets tips, but she is not entirely dependent on the tips. And so when somebody tries to harass her, she can say, buzz off. She can count on a wage from her employer like every other worker in every other industry. It's so funny. Last year, if you remember, Joe Biden introduced the Raise the Wage Act, a federal bill to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour and end the subminimum wage for tipped workers, workers with disabilities, and youth. He introduced that as part of his first COVID package. I don't know if you remember this. And unfortunately, the Senate parliamentarian took it out of the first COVID package. But when that bill was looking like it might pass in Congress, early in Joe Biden's administration, the National Restaurant Association was spending a lot of money telling Congress members, do not vote for this, it will kill us. If we have to pay more than $2 an hour, we'll go out of business. So Newsweek did an expose, and in fact, they caught, in the same moment that the National Restaurant Association was telling this to Congress, in that same moment, February 2021, the CFO of Denny's, which is a major leader in the other NRA, was telling shareholders on an analyst call, public analyst call to shareholders, it'll be okay if this passes because Denny's California has outperformed the system. Denny's California has grown faster than Denny's anywhere else in the country because we pay our people more and therefore consumer spending is higher. So even the chains that lead the National Restaurant Association know this. In fact, after that happened, we organized a very large group of shareholders, combined assets of $4 trillion shareholder group, And we had them go after Denny's and say, wait a second, if you're saying that paying a higher wage allows the company to grow, you are going against shareholder interests by fighting the wage increase. And we got a second headline in Newsweek that said, shareholder revolt at Denny's. Because what they were saying to Congress was the exact opposite of what they were telling shareholders, which is that, in fact, paying a higher wage is good for the bottom line. And it's been proven over and over and over again in state after state that raises the wage. So all of this was problematic pre-pandemic. It was problematic for a huge workforce. I told you this issue doesn't, in fact, sometimes when I speak, people hear tipped workers or restaurant workers and they think, oh, that's a tiny, tiny little population. Why are we spending time talking about it? This is one of the largest and fastest growing industries in America. It is the bottom of the economy, so it matters because it drags the whole economy down. And it matters because the National Restaurant Association is the major blocker for wage increases for all workers, not just restaurant workers. Because the National Restaurant Association opposed that bill that Joe Biden had introduced, all 32 million Americans that could have gotten a raise through that bill in all industries did not get a raise. So it's important to understand, why is this National Restaurant Association fighting this so hard? And why do we allow this to happen? Well, it turns out restaurant workers are no longer willing to allow this to happen, because during the pandemic, everything changed. Everything changed. The issue was an injustice. I like to say it was a racial, economic, and gender injustice pre-pandemic. With the pandemic, it became a matter of life and death. Because with the pandemic, 6 million restaurant workers lost their jobs in March of 2020. Remember March 16th, 2020. 6 million restaurant workers lost their jobs. And we started a relief fund for these workers. We unexpectedly raised, people were so sympathetic. They saw restaurants shut down around the country. They realized what we had been saying all along was true, which is, I like to say, these workers they were living tip to mouth. They were getting tips one day in the restaurant. They had absolutely no savings. When you earn $2, you don't actually get a wage. If any of you have ever earned a subminimum wage as a tipped worker, you know that subminimum wage goes to taxes. You live entirely off your tips. So they went to work one day, got tips. Maybe they used it to pay the rent or feed their children. The next day the restaurant was closed, no tips, no savings, nothing. So 6 million restaurant workers lost their jobs. We immediately started this relief fund, unexpectedly raised like $24 million from donors all over the country, gave it all out because 270,000 workers came to us for relief from all 50 states, including here in Rhode Island, and told us the most heart-wrenching stories. 1 in 3 of these workers told us that somebody died in the restaurant from COVID. This is something we don't talk about. We didn't talk about much then, and we don't talk about it now. We all know people died in the last several years from COVID. We don't know the extent of it, particularly in groups like restaurant workers who had no health insurance, who were exposed the entire time of the pandemic, long before there was a vaccination, long before we even understood the value of wearing a mask. These workers from day one were in the restaurants, preparing our meals while we were sitting at home getting deliveries, and 1 in 3 died. At the time, the CDC named restaurants the most dangerous place for adults to be. And UCSF, which is a top medical school in this country, named restaurants the most dangerous place to work above hospitals. Because at least in a hospital, there were multiple precautions taken for workers. In a restaurant, not only did nobody bother to find out how workers were protected, but everybody who was eating was not masked. You can't wear a mask and eat or drink, so that was not happening. And especially for workers, serving people or going to people's homes, it was a very, very highly dangerous job. And so what was a matter of injustice became a matter of life and death. When those 6 million workers lost their jobs, something really, like a light bulb, I really felt this collective light bulb going off over millions of workers' heads. Why did we accept this all this time? For the first time in my 20 years of organizing, I heard workers who came to us for relief saying, why did we accept this? And we should not go back. We should never go back to the way things were. We cannot go back unless we get one fair wage. The first time I had ever heard it in March of 2020. At that time, so many workers realized that the worst thing they thought could ever happen in their life, which was losing a crappy job that they always disliked, that they always felt was too little, that they always suffered through. And they thought the worst thing that could happen, it's a terrible job, but the worst thing that could happen is that I lose it. Because what would I do? How would I feed my kids? And they lost it. And for those that survived through that period, they realized I can survive without this $2 job. I can do something else. I can go back to school. I might actually take great pride, by the way, in being a server. I want to work in hospitality, but I can't actually afford to work in hospitality. All these speculations, what's wrong with these people? Why are they so lazy? Why can't they come back to work in restaurants? People are making very rational economic decisions that the economics professors here at the great University of Rhode Island teach you. Very rational decisions. If it costs you more to get to work than you get when you get to work, you should not go to that job because you are paying more than you are receiving. That is a rational decision. And so some left, some moved on, did other things. Some went back in the summer of 2020 when many of us started to enjoy outdoor dining again. Some went back. They found tips had gone way down because sales were down. Harassment went way up. This is an industry that already had the highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry. And we heard from thousands of women. I'm regularly asked, take off your mask so I can see how cute you are before I decide how much I want to tip you. Take off your mask so I can see the pretty face of my server before I decide how much I want to tip. Take off your mask. I want to stick my tongue down your throat. I did not make up these comments to be crass right here. We put out a call to women. We received about 6,000 comments. I am telling you, repeating some of the comments that we received. It was so bad, we worked with Professor Catherine McKinnon, who is a legendary law professor who coined the term sexual harassment. We put out a report and we called it masculine harassment, a new form of sexual harassment that emerged with the pandemic, forcing women to basically expose themselves and their families to the virus, risk their lives for the chance, not the guarantee, for the chance that somebody might like their face and therefore tip them. But the real breaking point, all of this was pretty horrific, but the real breaking point was being asked to enforce COVID protocols on the same people from whom they had to get their income. Wear a mask, sit 6 feet apart, show me your vaccination card. You know, these workers said, you are asking me to do now 2 jobs for the price of a subminimum, not even a minimum wage. I was a server and a bartender, now I'm a public health marshal. And the amount of abuse these workers received for trying to enforce rules that they were not paid to enforce resulted in more people dying, resulted in people getting tipped less. We had a member who was punched in the face, and we had a member in upstate New York who was shot for trying to enforce these rules. People got screamed at, racial and verbal, sexual epithets, and much worse for black workers, by the way. 60% of all workers said, my tips went down. With the pandemic, 70% of black workers said my tips went down. 70% of all workers said when I try to enforce COVID protocols, I get tipped less. 85% of black workers said when I try to enforce these COVID protocols, I get tipped less. People were not trying to hear from a black server, wear a mask, sit 6 feet apart, or show me your vaccination card. And so people said, I'm done. This is unbearable. It's unlivable. And they started leaving. 1.2 million Americans in the restaurant industry left the industry over the last year. 1.2 million. And of those who remain, and we've surveyed thousands, 54% say they're leaving. 80% say the only thing that would make them come back is a full livable wage with tips on top. And so the most extraordinary, miraculous thing has happened in the wake of all of these millions of workers leaving, saying, I'm done. If the cost of a gallon of gas is more than my hourly wage, I can no longer go to that job. You told me if I didn't like it, leave, so I left. And they left, and they left, and they left in huge numbers. And as a result, we are now seeing thousands of restaurants across the country. We actually got funding to create this huge database. We've been scraping job postings off Indeed. We found more than 5,000 restaurants in 43 states, including right here in Rhode Island, that used to pay $2 and $3 that are now paying $25, $30, $35 an hour. We're seeing restaurants in Cape Cod paying $50 an hour plus tips because they cannot get staff to come back any other way. We are seeing restaurants in Dallas where the wage was $2.13 an hour, now paying $25. And in Massachusetts, the wage is $5.05. We're seeing restaurants pay $50. That's 1,000% wage increase. And it may seem to you like, oh, that's a bubble that's not going to last. You know, I've studied economics. I'm sure many people here have as well. The history of supply and demand tells you you don't pay $2 and go up to 25 and then expect to go back to 2 and that your workers are going to stay with you. Because guess what? Workers have learned they don't have to stay here in this industry. They've moved on. So these higher wages are not, at least in the restaurant industry, are not going anywhere. They're here to stay. The real question is, what do we do about them? We've heard from so many thousands of small business restaurant owners, I am having to pay more to get workers to come back to work, but it's not fair. Everybody should pay more. We should all be going up together. Denny's and IHOP should pay more if I'm paying more. And also they're saying, it's not enough. I'm paying 15 and 20, but I still can't get enough staff because workers don't actually trust yet that these are permanent wage increases and that it's worth coming back to work in restaurants. They worry, as we speculate, maybe the wages are going back down from 25 to 2. That's not a guarantee. Listen, these workers, millions of them, changed their lives. They were in the restaurant industry for years. They took great pride in that work, by the way. They took great pride in that work. They changed their life during the pandemic to go do something else, go back to school, find a different profession, take on a different career. What would make them come back to this industry without the guarantee of a livable wage? Nothing. And I've surveyed thousands. There's nothing that would make them come back to this industry without the guarantee of a livable wage. We had a restaurant owner in New York that works with us say to the governor of New York, it's like we're fishing in an understocked lake. No matter how great our bait is, if there's not enough fish in the lake, we'll never be able to catch enough fish to reopen our restaurant. No matter how high our wages, if policy doesn't signal to millions of workers, these are permanent wage increases, it is worth coming back to work in restaurants, they are not coming back. And so you, I'm sure, here in Kingston and in Providence are seeing the help wanted signs. You're seeing the signs that say, I'm sorry, we can't be open on Mondays or Tuesdays because we don't have enough staff. Or you're experiencing restaurants being understaffed and the service is slower than usual. That will not change. That will not change until wages go up. And so in this moment of incredible historic upheaval, and it's truly historic because people have not rejected this wage structure en masse since emancipation. It's been in place since emancipation. 160 years is the first time millions of workers are rejecting this wage structure en masse. So it's historic. And in the context of this historic refusal to work for subminimum wages and historic change in restaurants from 2 to 25 and 30, we decided it was a historic moment and a very important moment to go big. And so in February of this year, we announced that we're moving bills and ballot measures in 25 states by the United States 250th anniversary. We call it our 25 by 250 campaign. 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the birth of our nation. What kind of country do we want to be at our quarter millennium? Do we want to carry with us the vestiges of slavery into our next quarter millennium? Do we want to carry with us the level of economic inequality that exists right now into our next quarter millennium? Do we want to carry into our next quarter millennium the massive staffing crises that a lot of these low-wage industries are facing? Or do we want actually to declare independence from a lot of these legacies of slavery, sources of sexual harassment, and income inequality? Do we want to move on to something better and different? And I want to tell you, the restaurant industry at least, maybe the rest of the country has a way to go, but the restaurant industry has made a decision and there is no turning back. The restaurant industry has made the decision to move towards a sustainable future, not the National Restaurant Association. They don't represent the entire industry. I'm talking about thousands of small independent restaurants have decided the only future, actually, is to pay a higher wage and provide a more appealing job. There have been multiple New York Times pieces in the last couple of weeks we've been featured in, including a guest essay I wrote in the July New York Times in July. And one of the titles of one of these New York pieces is How to Make a Unlovable Job More Appealing. And it featured all of the research we had done showing this tremendous shift in all these restaurants trying to raise wages, increase mobility, offer more offerings, benefits, and other offerings to make the job more appealing, to entice workers to come back. It is not that these jobs are low skill. It is not that people don't love working in hospitality. It is that it is no longer a tenable job. And as I said, it's a very rational decision to say, I cannot afford to work in this. As much as I love this industry, I cannot actually afford to work in this industry any longer. And so with this 25-state campaign, we are so thrilled and excited that we actually had our very first major victory in July when Michigan, the state of Michigan, became the 8th state in the United States to end the subminimum wage for tipped workers and to raise the wage 400% from $3 to $12 an hour. And that happened, that huge victory happened, believe it or not, because of Republicans. Republicans typically do not support raising the minimum wage. In fact, I have talked to many Republican legislators who believe there should not be a minimum wage at all. They believe that it is fine to allow the market to determine your wage. So if you want to accept zero, take zero. There should not be a minimum wage in their opinion. But in this case, we had collected 400,000 signatures to put a wage increase of 400% from $3 to $12. And $12 is not a livable wage, but it's better than $3. We had collected 400,000 signatures to put that on the ballot in November 2018. The Republicans who lead the legislature in Michigan announced to the press, we are concerned that this minimum wage measure being on the ballot will drive people to vote. We are concerned that it will drive workers, people of color, women to vote. We don't want them to vote. And so we're going to raise the wage, and we promise, they said, we promise to gut this after the election. They were making a promise to their business champions that they would gut the wage after the election. So they raised the wage. They took our ballot measure off the ballot. They took the exact language of our measure and made it the law. And then right after the election during lame duck, they raised it from 3 to 12. Right after lame duck, they drove it back down from 12 to 3. And a year later, so many workers who earned $3 were told, sorry, you earned too little. You do not qualify for unemployment insurance. And that happened to 2/3 of tipped workers across this country, including here in Rhode Island. They were told your tips don't count towards the calculation of your benefits. Sorry, you don't get unemployment. I will give you the example of a mom that we work with in Michigan named Sarah Mae Seward. Sarah Mae is the mother of an autistic child. She's a bartender in upstate Michigan, small town in a dive bar she works. And she told us, I religiously reported my tips to the IRS, but when I went to apply for unemployment insurance, when I lost my job in March of 2020, the state of Michigan told me, your boss never reported your tips, so it looks like you just earned $3.67. And so it looks like you didn't work enough to qualify for unemployment insurance. So she was marked as a denial. Then she applied for federal unemployment insurance. Supposedly the federal unemployment insurance was supposed to go to everybody regardless of their income, but it came through the state system. So when Sarah Mae applied, she was told, yes, you're eligible, you should get this. But she never could actually access the money because the state had marked her as the denial, and so when the federal money came through, she was blocked. So Sarah Mae Seward never got unemployment insurance, and she is one of about 4 or 5 million workers across this country who never got unemployment insurance because they were told their wages were too low. And then 2 years later, when they refused to go back to the restaurant industry because they said, if the government tells me I earn too little, I probably earn too little and I shouldn't go back to this job. And when they didn't go back to work, then the media and elected said, oh, look at these lazy people staying home collecting unemployment insurance, when most folks never got the unemployment insurance to begin with. Well, Sarah Mae ended up working with us, big campaign over the last many years. She ended up running for office. She's about to become a state representative in Michigan. And in July, Michigan courts declared that what the Republicans did back in 2018, raising the wage and then reversing it back down, was unconstitutional. And therefore, their original law that they passed is now the law of Michigan. So because Republicans attempted to suppress the vote in Michigan, we now won one fair wage in the state of Michigan. Thanks. And that's just the beginning. We are, as you saw, the MSNBC quoted the New York Times, which was a story we worked on for months with that reporter, and they cited our 2 ballot measures. We've got a ballot measure on the ballot in D.C. to raise the wage for tipped workers from $5 to $16 an hour, and on the ballot in Portland, Maine, to raise the wage from $6.50 to $18 an hour plus tips. And I got to tell you, minimum wage measures never fail on the ballot. In the history of the United States, in red, blue, and purple states, minimum wage measures never, ever fail because most Americans agree. And you heard me say it, it always polls between 60 and 80%, doesn't matter the state. Most Americans agree, whether they're Republicans, whether they're Trump supporters, whether they're Democrats or independents. Most Americans agree that when you work, you should be paid. You should be paid by your employer. You should be paid a wage that allows you to survive. Because what kind of country are we in which you actually work? You may work 2 and 3 jobs, and you still don't earn enough to feed your children. You still don't earn enough to not be on public assistance. You still don't earn enough to survive, even though you are working very, very hard in a job that in Europe is considered to be a skilled profession. What does it say about us as a country when that happens? It says that it's time to end these legacies of slavery that have ongoing implications for our economic system and our ability, frankly, to survive as an economy. I haven't even talked to you at all about consumption power, but clearly what the Denny's CFO said last year is true. If we don't allow people the ability to consume, and right now the costs have gone up so high and the wages are still so stagnated that a lot of people are not consuming the way they typically might because they don't have the funds to do so. And when we don't allow consumption to happen, that hurts all of us. It hurts our GDP. It hurts our economy. So we are on the precipice of tremendous change because it's on the ballot in D.C. we're going to win. It's on the ballot in Portland we're going to win. And we've got about 10 states, New York, Massachusetts next door to you, Illinois, Vermont, that's where I'm going tomorrow morning, they've got a bill. Colorado, we've got 10 states that are moving legislation in January to end the subminimum wage for tipped workers, including Rhode Island. And following Rhode Island, we're on the ballot in many more states to come. We've already mapped out the 25 states, and we know we're going to win because wages are going up right now. It is an incredibly hopeful moment. And so we'd love to work with any of you or all of you who'd like to work with us to raise wages here in Rhode Island and end this $3 ridiculous wage here in Rhode Island. We'd like to work with any of you and all of you who can share your stories or maybe your children's stories of having worked in this industry and struggling on tips and a ridiculously low wage that actually goes entirely to taxes so you do not see it. We'd love to work with any of you or all of you who'd be interested in talking to workers about this. Workers can vote, and we know this issue mobilizes them. In Michigan in 2018, when the Republicans did this to us, we actually ran a big voter program with about 100,000 workers. We saw a 300% increase in voter turnout among low-wage workers that year. Because we know that putting person's wage on the ballot, making it an issue of an election, is the most possible appealing thing that you could do. It's more popular, as I said in the MSC, it's more popular than almost any candidate or elected that is currently elected in the United States. It's almost twice as popular because it's our pocketbooks. It's our ability to feed our children. It's our ability to pay the rent and the bills and have a stable livelihood. It's our ability to survive and thrive and not just pay the bills, not just survive, but actually participate in our democratic society. Because I want to tell you one thing. We are, beyond everything I've talked about, beyond the economy, we do truly have a real problem, a burgeoning problem in this country. We are teetering, really, on the brink of truly being in danger of losing democracy. We are truly on the brink of a very dangerous direction that takes us away from clean and fair elections, that takes us away from faith in our elected systems, in our media. We are on the brink. And the only way to resolve that, the only way to come back from that brink, is to mobilize millions of people who are currently so disaffected from the political system to get engaged in the political system. But I ask you, why would workers here in Rhode Island, why would they vote if they've seen both parties come through the State House and their wage has stayed at $3.89? Again, a rational choice. Would you take time off from 3 jobs to get tips for your kids to go vote when you've not seen any change for decades in your wage? This $2 wage has been around for 31 years. We have members who are mothers and daughters who've worked for the same wage, and no candidate or party or elected has changed that. So unless we address the needs of working people, we cannot yell at them or scream at them for not being engaged politically. If we want them to get engaged politically, we have to address their basic needs. Their ability to feed their kids, their ability to survive and thrive, and have the space and capacity to think about climate change and abortion and everything else we're so angry at people for not worrying about. So let's not blame people who have very little time and space and ability to worry about voting and tell them, why aren't you voting? Go vote. What's wrong with you? Instead, we should be putting their issues on the ballot and actually addressing them, because we cannot afford another going into our next quarter millennium without a democracy. Plain and simple. Thanks.
Thank you, Saru. That was inspiring. We have questions. I know Saru wanted to have a conversation after her talk, so.
So I'd love to support restaurants that are paying a reasonable wage. How do I know which restaurants are paying a reasonable wage and which ones aren't?
Great question. We have a website you can go to called highroadrestaurants.org, H-I-G-H, road, R-O-A-D, restaurants.org. And if you scroll down in that website, you'll see a map, and you can pick what state you're in or what region you're in, and it'll tell you what restaurants we're seeing right now that are posting on Indeed for higher wages. And as I said, although the wage here in Rhode Island is $3.89, we are seeing restaurants here paying $15, $20, and up, because that's how they're realizing they're going to attract and retain staff.
Hello. Yes. Thanks so much, Saru, for your talk. I just wanted to go back to something that you said, that, well, higher minimum wage is actually good for the bottom line. Why is it such a tough sell then, especially with the other NRA? and where are we at in terms of like getting the major players in the other NRA to see that this is actually a viable strategy?
Yeah, it was a really great question that I'm going to repeat in case you didn't hear it, and tell me if I got it right. She said she wanted to hear more about what I said, that paying a higher wage is actually good for the bottom line. And if that's the case, why is it such a hard fight? Why can't we get the National Restaurant Association and the chains that lead it to actually agree? If it's actually more profitable, as Denny's admitted, why can't we get them to agree? So first I want to explain why it's better for the bottom line. So we have done years of research on this, years. We did it with the Cornell School of Industrial and Labor Relations. We've done it with economists and thousands of restaurant owners doing case studies. You may know I'm an academic in addition to being an advocate, and so we've done years of research on this. We've even calculated, after surveying and talking to thousands of restaurant owners, how much employee turnover costs the average small restaurant. And here's the thing. Restaurant industry has the highest rates of employee turnover of any industry in the United States. This issue of 1.4 million workers leaving the industry, it's not actually new. Even pre-pandemic, the industry was facing a massive staffing crisis. Not as bad as now, but they were. And it's because there's so much churn. It's a 300% turnover rate. That's 3 people in one position in 1 year. That costs an immense amount of money. Every turn, we calculated, costs a restaurant about $12,000 because it's rehiring, retraining. The employee morale goes down when you keep bringing in a new staff. You have employee theft when you have high levels of turnover, very low sales because somebody who's brand new just can't sell the food and the wine, as well as somebody who's been there a long time. The quality of food goes down when you have high rates of turnover. So turnover is a huge expense that is not calculated as part of a typical profit and loss statement. And it actually does, it's quantifiable, and it costs employers money. And so why so many restaurants, we have an association of high road restaurant owners. These are restaurant owners that take the high road to profitability. They are committed to livable wages, ethical practices. It was 800 restaurants in our association pre-pandemic. It's 2,500 restaurants today because so many restaurants during the pandemic realized a couple of things. One, they couldn't get staff unless they raised wages. After the murder of George Floyd, we heard from hundreds of restaurants that said, I just want to move away from these really racist practices. Many people knew this is a legacy of slavery, but also there is now irrefutable data that tipping in this country is not actually simply correlated with the quality of service of the server. It is correlated with the race and gender of the server. So white men always get tipped more than black women, even if a black woman works alongside a white man and provides what researchers call perfect service. They always get tipped less. It is because of all of our universal, I'm saying everybody in this room has something called implicit bias. If you want to learn more about implicit bias, look it up on Harvard University's website. There's even a little test you can take. There's nobody in this room that does not have implicit bias. It is unconscious bias that we have as Americans from everything we've seen and read and been fed for our entire lives. Because there's bias in our society, and it is in us, whether we want to admit it or not. And so we are not consciously discriminating, but unconsciously, we always tip people of color, and especially women of color, less. It results in a $6 per hour wage gap between black women and white men servers in the United States. So a lot of restaurants know this data. They know it intuitively. And so after the murder of George Floyd, hundreds of restaurants approached us and said, we want to change. We want to do things differently. So between not finding enough staff and wanting to do things differently, and also being forced to try new business models during the pandemic, there was a time when there was no service, no dining floor, and therefore everybody got paid a full wage and the tips were shared and people found, wow, this is a better model, we like it better. So much change over the last couple of years. And through that process, so many more employers got involved and all kind of singing the same song that actually doing the right thing is not just better for business, it's actually the only way at this point our business is going to survive. Because we don't have enough staff. We won't be able to bring back enough staff unless we do these things. So it's better for the bottom line because it reduces turnover, it attracts and retains staff, it improves employee morale. Danny Meyer is one of the foremost legendary restaurant owners in the country. He owns Union Square Hospitality Group. He started Shake Shack. He's one of our members. We work with him pretty closely. He wrote a book called Setting the Table, and he said, we're a customer-facing business. As a customer-facing business, our number one priority has to be taking care of our workers because they're the ones who interact with our customers. They're the ones who will sell the food and the wine. They're the ones that present our experience as a positive one or a negative one, and so we have to invest in them. And so people like Danny Meyer believe that investing in your workforce is not just better for the bottom line, it is essential for the bottom line. So why, when they know it, when Denny's knows it, why would the National Restaurant Association fight this? I mean, it's something that I have asked myself over the years. Why is there such incredible resistance? And there are a couple of reasons. One is that these publicly traded companies report earnings and revenue in quarterly returns to shareholders. And the problem with reporting returns in a quarter is that if you invest in workers in month 1, you may not see returns by month 3, but you'll definitely see them by month 6. And so, but if you're entirely focused on quarterly returns, an investment in a workforce in month 1 may look to shareholders like a loss, when in fact it is an investment. And so that's part of the problem, is the idea of exposing only quarterly returns rather than even slightly longer returns for a business. But the other real issue is that you've got major chains that feel deeply invested in their ability to pay $2 and $3. And while they know paying $15 in California has resulted in growth, they want to be able to pay $2 for as long as they can. If they can get away with paying $2, they want to pay $2. And they believe it's better for their profit, overall profit. You know, not necessarily shareholder returns, but profit of the company. And so we see this deep resistance. Even when thousands of independent restaurants are moving in a different direction, you see these major corporate chains digging in their heels and resisting change with all their might. And in part, it comes from having this exemption that no other industry has had for the last 160 years. Here's the problem, though. If we continue to allow this industry to have this exemption, we are seeing more and more other industries try to replicate it because they're seeing the restaurant industry get something they don't have. So all of you have noticed, I'm sure, that we are suddenly tipping in a lot of environments where we never tipped before. Apple Pay and these tablets are suddenly introducing tipping into retail environments. We never tipped in retail environments. Coffee shops, we never really tipped when you buy a bottle of water or a muffin, you didn't tip. I've been asked to tip in a floral shop to the owner who turned the tablet around. So we are being asked to tip in new environments, and we are seeing employers attempt to try to emulate the restaurant industry, that when they introduce tipping, they too should be able to reduce their workers' wages from a full minimum wage to a sub-minimum wage. And one of the worst culprits of this is the gig companies. So Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Instacart, they have been found guilty of detracting from delivery worker payments by the amount that you tip. So you think when you tip a delivery worker, it goes on top of the wage. These companies have been found to actually detract every time you tip from what they pay the delivery worker. And that sounds outrageous, but that is exactly what the restaurant industry has done for 160 years. Every time you tip, it allows the employer to pay the worker less. That's the system. But here's the thing. The law says if tips don't bring you to the full minimum wage, the employer is supposed to make up the difference. That never happened. The Obama administration had the highest levels of enforcement of this law. They went after about 2,000 or 3,000 restaurants to see, are you actually making up the difference between the subminimum wage and the regular minimum wage if tips don't bring you there? They found an 84% violation rate with regard to employers actually making up this difference. That's a 16% compliance rate. But even if there was a 100% compliance rate, you'd still have a workforce that's majority women having to get tips to feed their kids and put up with the worst harassment of any industry to get those tips. And so it doesn't work. The system doesn't work. And we were actually on the cover of the New York Times last Thursday with a huge story. That was the story that was cited in that MSNBC piece that said battle over tipped wages heating up. And it was entirely about the fact that the majority of workers right now are saying tips aren't even bringing me to the full minimum wage regularly, and my employer never makes up the difference. So these are all major issues that detract from, this industry's future. And so many small businesses are seeing the future, and the chains are just resistant for a lot of bad reasons.
Any more questions? So, Saru, I hope that we don't have to wait very long until Rhode Island is, has passed a bill.
Yes. Well, we do have a bill that's being introduced in January. We would love to work with anybody and everybody. I was telling Patrick, in San Jose, California, the minimum wage went up several years ago. Before the state minimum wage went to 15, San Jose went to 15 first. And it was students in a college in a class project with their professor that said, we want to raise the minimum wage in San Jose, wrote the bill, took it to the San Jose City Council, got it passed, and that resulted in the entire state of California raising the wage as well. So students can do a lot, and we'd love to work with any of you that would want to work on this state bill with us. It's a great experience to learn how does legislation move? How do you advance an issue? How do you change the narrative? How do you push up against big corporate forces and still win?
Great project. Well, with that, please join me in thanking Saru for a very inspiring talk.